Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in. It's the 4th of July weekend, and you're listening to the Home in Progress 4th of July Extravaganza, brought to you by RepcoLite Paints and Benjamin Moore. Every single year, I celebrate the 4th on the show with a bunch of patriotic topics, and this year is no different. And I love what I've got coming up. And rather than tell you about it, I'm just going to jump right in because there's just so much good stuff that I want to get to, and I want to make sure I've got time to do it as well as I can. All right. I want to start this first segment with the most famous broken object in American history, the Liberty Bell. Now, you probably know exactly what the Liberty Bell looks like, or you can picture it. Big bronze bell, long jagged crack running up the side, the Liberty Bell, right? Here's the thing. Almost everything most of us think we know about it is a little bit off. It's a little bit off. So let's fix that, as much of that as we can anyway, in this first segment. And let's start here. Here's a question for you. What cause was the Liberty Bell made for? What was the reason it was made? What did people say, we need a bell for this? What was that cause? If you said the Revolution, you're wrong. That's not it at all. It wasn't cast to ring out independence. In fact, it was ordered way back in 1751, 25 years before the Declaration of Independence. And it was ordered for the Pennsylvania State House. Most likely, the cause that it was ordered for was most likely the 50th anniversary of Pennsylvania's original Constitution, a document called the Charter of Privileges, written by William Penn back in 1701. So the Liberty Bell wasn't connected to the Revolution from its very beginning. And then once the war started, it didn't necessarily play that big of a role. Now, it was in the Pennsylvania State House. So that's a big deal, I guess. That's the building that we now call Independence Hall. It was there in place when the Declaration of Independence was debated and adopted. So that's kind of cool. But dirt was there too. We're not celebrating dirt. So I don't know. It seems kind of passive. It wasn't really doing anything amazing there. It was just there. Also, there's a story that it was wrong to call people to the first reading of the Declaration of Independence. Now, that would be really cool if that was true. But historians, when they dig into it, historians really can drag us all down when you really think about it. We have a lot of great stories that historians, come around later and say, well, that really didn't happen, because there's no evidence or anything to support it at all. And that's too bad because I really like the story. But it seems like with, the bell ringing out, the first reading of the Declaration of Independence, seems like that story is just kind of made up. Didn't happen. So when we equate the Liberty Bell with the Revolution, we're really not getting the story all that right. Okay, another thing you may not know about the Liberty Bell. It was a complete lemon. From day one, a lemon. It was ordered from a foundry over in London, shipped across the ocean. It got to Philadelphia. They get it out of the box. They're all excited. They probably made an unboxing video because that's so, popular. Everybody loves to see things come out of the box. They took all those little packets of desiccant where it says, don't eat these and make sure you throw them away. They threw them away so their kids wouldn't eat them. And they got that bell out and they rang it. And on that very first ring, it cracked. I would love to know what that guy, the guy, the first ringer, what he felt like when he rung the bell and it cracked. Well, anyway, they've got this brand new, really expensive, cracked bell. What are you going to do? They don't want to ship it back all the way to England. That's a lot. That's not going to be inexpensive. UPS back then, it's still pricey. So two guys show up and, they're Philadelphians and they're metal workers and they say, we can fix it. Their names are John Pass and John Stowe. You probably know their names from the National Treasure movie with Nick Cage because they're featured in there, or at least the bell's featured in there. Anyway, they say they'll fix it. So they take the bell. They break it all to pieces. They melt it down. They cast a new bell. But then when they ring that one didn't sound right. So they melt it down again, cast it again, and finally that second attempt is more or less the bell we know today. So it took 3 tries, all basically starting from scratch to get to the final bell. So that's another thing you maybe didn't know. Last thing I've got for you, the name Liberty Bell. It's got to have something to do with the Founding Fathers, right? It's got to be the name they used. Well, it's not. For most of its life, it was just the State House bell or the bell in the steeple. It was just one bell among many. The name Liberty Bell first shows up in abolitionist circles in the 1830s. People fighting to end slavery looked up at that bell and they saw a Bible verse from Leviticus, which is engraved on it. And that verse reads, "Proclaim liberty throughout all the land unto all inhabitants thereof." They saw that and said, "That's our bell. We're going to claim that bell." And they renamed it the Liberty Bell. And eventually the name stuck. So the Liberty Bell, it's named for a fight that came years and years after the Revolution was over. All right, so that's the Liberty Bell. How much of that did you know? How much was new? I don't know. I thought it was a fun little story. And yeah, that's the first thing I've got. Now let's take a break, and then let's go from bells to front doors. Think about what you think colonial front door colors might have been. And when we come back, I'll give you the real scoop. That's all coming up right after this. Home in Progress is brought to you by RepcoLite Paints and Benjamin Moore. People often think of paint as just another line item on the project supply list. But here's the thing. Everything you do, every hour of prep, every stroke of the brush, all comes down to the quality of the paint. The paint is the project. Make sure it's the best. And we're back. You're listening to Home in Progress, the Home in Progress 4th of July Extravaganza. Not just Home in Progress, but the Extravaganza version. Brought to you by RepcoLite Paints and Benjamin Moore. And as I mentioned in the open, every year on the 4th, I love to dig into topics that loosely surround, time periods of the Revolution or are patriotic in nature, things like that. I like to have a little bit of fun. And right now, I want to talk about colonial front doors. And before we get to the front door, let's start with colonial whole houses. Okay, I didn't realize this, but on a lot of late 1700s New England homes, they were putting their money and their creativity and their skill and all of that into the front of the house. Okay, the face of the house, the side that looked out on the road. That side got all the good stuff. It got clapboard siding, it got little embellishments around the windows and the doors, and it got paint. The sides and the back, though, they were often covered in rougher shingles, and pretty much left alone to weather. I didn't know that. Over the years, that bare wood would go from silver to gray, brown, whatever, in the salt air, and nobody minded. Nobody cared because nobody important was looking at the back of your house or the sides of your house, just your family. Just your family, just your neighbors, just your friends, the people you have over for barbecues and stuff like that. But the important people, the ones going by the front of the house, the front door people, they got the good show. They saw the good stuff as they drove by in their fancy carriages or when they walked up to your front door. All right, so I had no idea that was happening, that they put their energy and their time into the front of the house and just let the back go. Okay, that's interesting, but it gets more interesting, at least to me. Now, for a lot of us, when we think about, colonial houses, we think white, right? We think white colonial houses. It's just kind of a thing. And in reality, white is part of the story, but it's really not the whole story. It's not as big a part of the story of colonial, the color scheme and all of that as we might think it was. In the late 1700s, a clapboard house might be white or off-white if the owner had money. But it might just as easily be red-brown, yellow ochre, gray, tan, or pretty much just left to weather, especially on a simpler, rural home. So the front has got fancier materials on it, but it's not like it's coated with amazing colors or something like that. Not in a lot of cases. It's just a lot of cases just left to weather. But there was one place that got paint a great deal of the time. Even if the house is weathering, there's one part of that front of the house that's getting paint, and it's the front door. It was the place that people would put color so they could make a statement, without the expense of painting the entire home. The front door was hugely important, even back then, 250 years ago, hugely important. And it's still true today, right? When you pull up to somebody's house or drive by somebody's house, your eyes naturally go to the front door. When you visit, that's where you usually go, unless you're family, and then you kind of slink in through the garage. But real guests go to the front door. It's the part of the house that usually makes the first statement to the world at large. And that was just as true 250 years ago as it is today. And so, we fuss over them. Some of us do anyway. Lots of us do. Lots of us fuss over them. We want the color that we pick to be just right. And that's not a new thing. Even back in colonial times, that front door mattered and the color of the door mattered. Now, what I want to talk about for the rest of the segment is some of the common front door colors, back then. But before I do that, let's quickly talk about how we even know. I'm going to tell you what some of the common colors were, but I'm going to tell you how we know and how we know really, really accurately. We're not just guessing. We really scientifically know what colors they were using, 250 years ago on their front doors, because really it's complicated. The original paint is long gone. It's buried under 20 coats, slapped on over a couple centuries. So how do you figure out what it used to be? You can't just look at an old house and just know what the color was in 1750. And you can't trust an old painting of it either. There are no photographs. Yeah, photographs would be easy, but we'd have to wait till color. That's a problem. You can't go to paintings. The artist may have taken liberties with it. The colors in the paintings may have faded. The paint in the painting may have faded. So how do we know what colors the colonists were using, and how do we know it really, really accurately? Well, the answer is something called cross-section microscopy. And the way this works is a conservator goes to the house and he finds a spot where the old paint survived. Usually it's a protected little corner behind a shutter hinge, under a piece of molding, something like that. When they find that spot, they take a tiny sample, smaller than the head of a pin, and then they set that chip in clear resin. They polish it down so they can look at it from the side, like looking at the edge of a stack of paper, and then under the microscope, every single coat of paint that house ever wore shows up in its own little layer. You count straight down through the years, layer by layer, all the way to the very first coat that ever touched the wood. And then they identify the actual pigments and match the color to a standard scale while making allowances for the way old paint yellows and fades. And they come up with the color that was originally on the house. Now, the guy who pioneered this in America is named Frank Welsh, and he's read the paint on Independence Hall, on the White House, on Grand Central Terminal. He's basically saved over 50,000 paint samples in his career. And back in the 1980s and the 1990s, Colonial Williamsburg brought him and his methods in to do the first really scientific study of the paint on their historic buildings. And what they found turned things absolutely upside down. Because for decades, everybody thought colonial colors, if you don't know any better, just guess. What do you think colonial colors look like? I kind of tipped my hand here. But most people kind of assumed colonial colors were soft, muted, grayed down shades. They were quiet, dusty. Turns out, nope, everybody was wrong. The real colors, the original colors, were bolder, brighter, more saturated than anybody believed. The soft look people had been copying was just old, faded, dirty paint. That's what we were looking at, and we were assuming that was the real original color. Williamsburg has actually gone back and repainted buildings to match what the science turned up. So the truth is, colonials really like their color a lot more than we give them credit for. Okay, so that's how we can know what colors were used. Now let's get into what they were, what the actual colors on the front doors were. Basically, if you were to go strolling down the streets in 1775 New England, what front door colors would you have likely seen? And the first thing to know is that the front door was usually trying to do exactly, back then, exactly what front door colors and front doors are supposed to do today, stand out. Even back then, the door was supposed to pop, if you want to say that. It was supposed to catch your eye. So door colors tended to run deeper and bolder than whatever was, behind them on the rest of the house. So generally speaking, if you were walking through a New England town in the late 1700s, these are the kinds of front door colors you'd likely run into. And first off, let's start in the dirt. There was a whole family of deep red browns that came from iron in the soil. The same literal stuff that makes rust red. One of these common ones was called Spanish brown. It was a dull, brick, reddish brown. Dirt cheap, because it literally came from the dirt. And it was a really common color to find on doors or on the trim around the doors. Green, that was another big color for doors and shutters in colonial times, a deep earthy green. You'd see plenty of that. To this day, if you picture a classic colonial door, a lot of us picture a dark green door, and that's because that's really what they were doing. That look goes way back. So you've got that rust red, that kind of dirty rust red. You've got greens. Black shows up on the doors too. More as you move a little bit later in time. So you kind of move out of the late 1700s into the early 1800s. You start to see more black. It looked deep. It looked formal. It looked really sharp against a pale house. So you've got those colors. And then this one's a little bit surprising. There's white and creamy off-whites for the front doors. Those came from white lead, and white lead in your paint, that costs a fair amount of money at the time. So if you had a crisp white or a light door, that was way more of a statement than we tend to assume it was. Nowadays, that's kind of a little bit boring. I don't know that you hardly ever see that unless it's something that nobody's painted yet. Back then, that was a statement. There was a little bit of money behind that one. So you've got white, creamy off-whites. Blue is another color. A really strong blue was hard to make for most of history, but in the 1700s, a new pigment called Prussian blue came along. It was a deep, rich, slightly greenish blue, and it was a huge sensation all over the place. A blue door, said you could afford something special, because that one wasn't cheap either. And then at the very top of the price list, there was one red that was pretty much nothing like the cheap brick red from the dirt that we talked about earlier. There was a bright, clean, brilliant fire engine red, and that one came from a pigment called vermilion. And vermilion was crazy expensive. At times in history, it was worth just about its weight in gold. That's an exaggeration, but it was really valuable. So a truly bright red door was about the loudest way to tell the world that you had money. You got red doors, people see that, they know you got money. They know if I'm inclined to rob a house, maybe that's the one. That's what red said. There's money here. There's all kinds of extravagance and all kinds of amazing things here. That's what that red door says. So that's the range you'd see on the doors. Deep greens, dark red browns, black, creamy whites, the occasional special blue, and then that one luxury fire engine red way at the top. And I think that's what I love about all of this, because when we talk about colonial America, especially around 4th of July, we tend to picture everything, I picture everything in parchment colors, right? Old paper, brown wood, gray stone, powdered wigs, candlelight, even the red and the blue and the white on the flag, the red and the blue in my mind are muted, toned down, all of that. But the real world, it wasn't that way. The real colonial world wasn't that way. These people cared about color. They cared about first impressions. They cared about what their house said from the road. Curb appeal. They didn't have that word, but they sure did have the concept. Maybe they didn't have the money to paint the whole house. Maybe the sides and the back were going to weather gray and brown and, fend for themselves. But the front door, the front of the house, that all mattered. And the front door specifically was that place where homeowners could make a small investment and get a huge visual return. And honestly, that really hasn't changed all that much. 250 years later, we're all still doing the same thing, lots of us anyway. We stand in front of the paint display and we agonize over one tiny little part of the house. It's a quart's worth of paint, and yet we agonize over it. Is this red too much? Is it too loud? Is the green too serious? Whatever. We weigh these colors. And we do that because we know the front door speaks before anybody inside gets a chance to. So if you're looking for a summer project, a summer weekend project, just something little, check out your front door. What's it saying to the world driving by? What's it saying to you? Because it matters to us too as homeowners. That front door, what's it saying? If it's time for a change, if you need to change the message a little bit for your front door, swing into any RepcoLite and we'll help you find the perfect color. It's a quart of paint, like I said, about 4 hours worth of work, and it's got a huge payoff. All right, let's take a break, and when we come back, I want to dig into the real story of Betsy Ross. We know parts of her story. We're going to get the whole thing, and it's way better than what you think you know. That's coming up in just a minute. Stick around. Home in Progress is brought to you by RepcoLite Paints and Benjamin Moore. Think about it. You spend hours prepping, sanding, taping, and then finally painting. Don't throw all that work away with an inferior product. The paint isn't just another supply. The paint is the project. Make sure it's the best. And we're back. You're listening to the Home in Progress 4th of July Extravaganza, brought to you by RepcoLite Paints and Benjamin Moore. And yes, it is a full-fledged extravaganza. It's the real deal. It's the whole hog. a complete extravaganza. And right now, I want to talk about a character from the Revolutionary War period who I think we all know something about, or we think we do. We think we know something about this person. It's a tale that I think, I probably all of us know parts of. So picture the scene. Let's just imagine this in the theater of the mind. We're in Philadelphia, okay? It's June 1776. It's hot outside, right? The streets, they smell like Mackinac Island without the fudge and the candy and all that. Just the horses and the things the horses do. And then add to that a whole bunch of sweat smell, right? Because back then, deodorant, not a thing. And everybody's walking around in buckled shoes. They're wearing lots of heavy clothing. So they're sweating up a storm. That's where that wave of sweat smell is coming from. They're walking around doing that, and they're chatting vocally about England. Some are pro-England, some are against what England's doing, but that's the topic on everybody's mind. So that's what's going on all around. Well, as that's happening, we hear the bell on the door of a little shop, ding, and a secret committee of revolutionaries, 3 men, with George Washington among them, walk in to this little Philadelphia upholstery shop. All right, 1776, these 3 guys walk in. George Washington is there. The bell rings. This humble, young seamstress pops up from behind the counter and says, "May I help you?" Something like that. She said it in a very, probably not like that. That's more creepy than anything else. But she says, "May I help you?" And 2 of the men, stand by the front door. They're probably on either side of it. And they flip, I imagine they flip that open for business sign to closed, right? And then they pull the blinds down. And the seamstress, that startles her a little bit. She starts to ask, "What's going on here?" And that's when good old George Washington steps forward out of the shadows, probably. And he's got a scroll of paper in his hand, and he spreads it open on the table. And there, in the candlelight, the seamstress sees this rough sketch for a national flag. Okay, it's got 13 stripes. It's got 13 stars, and each star has 6 points. One of the men clears his throat. "Yar, can you make this?" He asks the question. I don't know if that was his real accent, but that's what I've got. Anyway, he asks that question. The seamstress, who of course is Betsy Ross, looks it over, mumbles to herself a little bit as she's thinking. She's probably nodding as she does that. And then she crosses her arms and looks at the men, one at a time, and then says, "I can do it, but we've got to lose these 6-sided stars. We've got to go with 5-pointed ones because it's way easier." "Yar, what do you mean, way easier?" The men were confused. It didn't make any sense. She grabs a piece of paper, folds it, says, "Look at this," and then with one single snip of her scissors, cuts out a perfect 5-pointed star. A great huzzah goes up, and all the men stamp their brass-buckled shoes in excitement before George, shushes everybody. "Shh, we're on a mission here, secret mission, guys, come on." He looks at Betsy. His eyes, probably water a little bit. His powdered wig, it's all powdery, doing its thing. And he asks in a deeply emotional voice, "You'll do it then?" And Betsy grasps his hands and nods. And tears, of course, well up in everyone's eyes. And the scene closes. All right, lots of us know that scene or some version of it. Betsy Ross makes the first American flag. It's a great little story. But is it true? Hold that thought. We're going to come back to it. But before we answer it or even try to, you really ought to meet the actual woman, the real Betsy Ross, because she's way cooler than the legend that we know. Because we only know a little bit about the legend. There's a lot about the real Betsy Ross that we know, and it's super cool stuff. All right, so let's meet her. She was born Elizabeth Griscom on New Year's Day, 1752 in Philadelphia. She was the 8th of 17 children. 17 children. I have 5 children. 17. Can only imagine. I mean, it's a ton of fun, but 17, that's something else. Anyway, she was the 8th of 17. She was raised Quaker, so plain, strict. Picture the guy on the oatmeal container. So that's how she was raised. But here's one thing that's kind of unusual about her upbringing. Her dad had her trained in a skilled trade rather, than just marrying her off. So Betsy gets apprenticed to a Philadelphia upholsterer named William Webster. And while she's working for William Webster, she learns to make and repair curtains and bed hangings, tablecloths, bed covers, slip covers, all of it. And just so you know, in the 1700s, being an upholsterer, that didn't just mean you're doing, couch repair and putting new fabric on an ugly couch or something like that. Being an upholsterer at that point in time was basically the interior design business of its day. Upholstery was considered one of the most prestigious and most lucrative of the craft trades. These were people who dressed the finest rooms. They made the curtains, the upholstered furniture, the bedding. They imported, all the fancy fabrics and trims, and they often did the work right in the client's home. So Betsy wasn't this humble seamstress that we tend to sometimes think she was. She was trained in the high-end decorating trade. All right? So that's her trade and what she was doing. At 21 years old, she falls in love with John Ross. He's a fellow apprentice and the son of an Episcopal minister. Now, marrying outside of the Quaker faith, that's a big, big fat nope. But Betsy, she's her own woman. She's feisty. She's independent. She's a bit rebellious. So she said, yeah, thanks, but no thanks, Quakers. The Quaker guys, anyway, the ones that I've got to choose from, they've got nothing on Mr. Ross. That's what she's thinking. So they eloped. They crossed the river to New Jersey, and they got married at a tavern because she's feisty, she's independent, and a bit rebellious. Now, of course, there was a price to pay for doing that, for making those choices, and she was expelled from the Quaker congregation and cut off from her family. So that was bad. There were some prices to pay, but there were some upsides to that. Now, first off, she didn't have as many birthday parties and, family get-togethers to go to. Just saying, with 16, brothers and sisters, 16 brothers and sisters, you got a birthday party or something every time you turn around. Well, she doesn't have to do that anymore. Freed up her calendar and her budget. Think of all the presents she doesn't have to buy. Christmas, birthdays, you can do the math. Anyway, so that was one upside to being, completely cut off from her family. A second upside is she married a fellow upholsterer. And with their shared skill sets and interests and all of that, her and John opened their own upholstery shop. Unlike a lot of women in her era, she was in business for herself, and we're talking she's 21 years old at this point. All right. I think we got another half of the story to go, and I think it's going to be smart to take a break right here. It's a good stopping point, and we'll pick up the other half of Betsy Ross's story, and we'll answer the question of whether or not she really did make that first American flag, and we'll do all of that right after this. You're listening to Home in Progress, where the projects are real, the mistakes, they're educational, sometimes painful, mostly educational, and the only thing more stubborn than that old wallpaper on your bathroom wall is your determination to get it fixed. Proudly sponsored by RepcoLite Paints and Benjamin Moore. Paint with a purpose, people who care, and everything you need to get the job done right. And we're back. You're listening to Home in Progress, the Home in Progress 4th of July Extravaganza. I don't know how many of them there have been. I've done one of these, many years. I don't know. I should have gone back and counted. Let's say the 5th, because I know I didn't do them all the time. This is the 8th year, doing some quick math. The 5th Home in Progress 4th of July Extravaganza, brought to you by RepcoLite Paints and Benjamin Moore. That's what you're listening to, and we're right in the middle of the story of Betsy Ross. We all know of Betsy Ross as the seamstress who made the first American flag, but there's way more to her story than that. And honestly, is that story even true? The first flag story. Is that even true? We're going to answer that at the end of this segment. But for now, let's keep going with the story. Now, we ended last segment with Betsy getting married to John Ross and then both of them opening an upholstery shop in Philadelphia. And things at that point were looking pretty good for Betsy. But it only lasted for a few minutes. And then the struggle started to hit. First, her husband died in 1775, basically 2 years into the marriage. And that left Betsy a widow at 24, running that whole shop by herself. Now, she remarried in 1777, so a couple years later, and her second husband, Joseph Ashburn, he was a sailor, he eventually gets captured by the British, and he dies in an English prison in 1782. The man who comes to tell her that her husband, Ashburn, had died, that man who comes to tell her that is John Claypole. He had been a prisoner alongside of him, and I should have looked into the dates and how this shook out. But after he explains that to her, a while later, she ends up marrying that guy. Now, that guy lasted a little bit longer. He didn't move on immediately following marriage to Betsy. They were married for 34 years before he died, and together they had 5 daughters. Now, through every bit of all of that turmoil, losing, 2, 3 husbands, through all of that, Betsy kept the business alive. Now, I think you're already starting to get a feel for the real Betsy Ross at this point. But I did run into a really colorful description that I really liked. She was, quote, a hard-nosed, snuff-loving businesswoman who was fond of storytelling. She wasn't this mild-mannered seamstress just waiting to do some domestic work, end quote. All right, so that's a picture of the real Betsy Ross. Anyway, I said that through all of the struggle, the turmoil, with losing her husbands, I said that she kept the business alive. Well, it gives the wrong idea. She didn't just keep the business surviving. She ran a thriving shop for about 50 years. Eventually, she goes on and runs the business with her daughters. Remember her last husband, her third husband gave her 5 daughters. Eventually, she runs the business with them. And then granddaughters, and then nieces, and eventually they carry it on for decades after Betsy passes away. Okay, that's kind of the quick overview of how her life shook out. Now let's go back to the Revolutionary War era and drill into the story and get to the answer about the flag story, the greater question we're trying to answer here. And I want to go back directly right now to 1774 because at this point in time, there's a really great interior design story for the real Betsy Ross. And it's a documented one. This one really happened. We've got no doubts about it. So in 1774, John Ross, her first husband, he's still alive at this point. The Ross shop made bed hangings for George Washington. The George Washington. Mount Vernon curators confirmed it in 2014, finding it in Washington's own cash records. Apparently, while he was in Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress, he paid John Ross, the upholsterer, at Betsy's shop, a down payment in gold coins for 3 sets of bed hangings for Mount Vernon. Now, the fabric, we've got all of this noted down. The fabric was a cotton chintz, it had purple floral prints, and it was edged in green. And just because, bed hangings, they're not exactly commonplace for us, so we don't really, appreciate what they said or the importance of them. But here's the scoop. A fully dressed bed, with all these hangings and stuff, was often the single most expensive piece of furniture in a house. So this was, wasn't just, basic work for George Washington, I'll just get the bed hangings here. This is prestige work, so they're doing really high-end work for a really, important American. That was 1774. So 2 years before any supposed flag visit, because if you can remember, and I know that's not easy because I ramble a lot, but the very open, that we did for the segment, the visit about the flag was 1776. The supposed visit about the flag. We've got real documented evidence that in 1774, 2 years before that, George Washington really did sit down, at least in Betsy Ross's shop. So we can put it there. All right, so 1774, they design bed hangings for George Washington, her and her husband do. During the war, now Betsy's husband has passed away. The war starts to break out, and Betsy's running the shop at this point. And in order to pay the bills and do whatever she's got to do, the shop did whatever brought money in. They were mending uniforms for the soldiers. They were sewing tents and blankets. They were even rolling paper cartridges packed with musket balls for the Continental Army. So all kinds of work, whatever it took to get through the war and to keep the shop going. All right, let's get back to that flag story at the beginning. Let's get to the truth. And as we try to do that, it's important to be clear that Betsy Ross absolutely made flags. We know that. It's documented. There's proof from the Revolutionary time period that she made flags. A Pennsylvania State Navy Board record dated back to May 29, 1777, shows that Elizabeth Ross was paid 14 pounds, 12 shillings, 2 pence for making ship's colors, which basically, ship's colors, state naval flags, okay? So her shop did make flags. We know that, 100%. But those were just, state naval flags. Do we have any proof that she made American flags? Well, actually, we do. From the early 1800s, we've got government contracts for U.S. flags made by Elizabeth Ross. Around 1810 to 1811, she made big garrison flags for U.S. arsenals, some 18 by 24 feet with well over 100,000 stitches each. We've got records of that. She made flags, and American flags at that, and she did it for over 50 years. But still, we've got the question, did she make the famous first flag of legend? Is that story that we open the segment with actually true? Well, here's the real scoop. First off, the story didn't come from Betsy's lifetime. That's the first tip-off. It surfaced in 1870, about a century after 1776, and 34 years after she died. Her grandson, William Canby, presented the story to the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, claiming that she had, quote, made with her hands the first flag. He said he'd heard it from an aunt in 1857. And my aunt told me this. It's got to be true, right? Well, even though it didn't have tons of evidence, concrete, what we'd like to call, documentation or anything like that, it didn't have that. It still caught on. And it caught on with the public because of timing, largely. The 1876 centennial was coming up, and it was going to be held in Philadelphia, her own city. The country itself was hungry for Revolutionary War stories, and it was really interested in ones that gave women, specifically women, a heroic role. Now, Betsy was the perfect symbol, and she was promoted as a patriotic role model for girls, so the story really, really spread. And even today, it's commonly accepted. However, historians have combed through the diaries, they've combed through letters, through the records of the Continental Congress, and they found absolutely nothing. Nothing. No flag committee, no meeting with Betsy Ross in 1776, no evidence from the time period at all that any of that really happened. And historians have concluded that that first flag story is almost certainly, just kind of invented. It's not real. Didn't really happen. So that committee never knocked on her door, probably no single magic first flag, nothing like that. But don't hear that as a letdown, because here's the thing. We do this with a lot of our heroes. We take a real complicated flesh and blood person and we, sand off all the rough edges until they're smooth, smooth enough to fit in a kid's book. They're acceptable to our modern sensibilities. We did it with Thomas Jefferson. We did it with Ben Franklin. We did it with Betsy Ross. We turned her into a sweet, quiet little seamstress sitting by the window stitching stars. And that version really is so much smaller than the real woman, because the real Betsy Ross was something else. She was, like I said, feisty. She was full of it. And, she got thrown out of her church for marrying the man that she loved. She buried a husband at 24. Then she buried a second one, then a third one. And they weren't things that she caused or brought about. I don't want to imply that. I'm not saying that. But 3 times a widow, though. And every single time she got back up, she kept her shop open and she took care of her family. She wasn't a hobbyist, with a needle and a thimble. She was a tradeswoman in what was the most respected craft of her day. She decorated George Washington's bedroom, and when the country went to war, she became, basically a defense contractor. She was cranking out flags, mending uniforms, rolling musket cartridges for the army. She ran her own business for about 50 years, and when she was finally done, she handed it on down to her daughters and her granddaughters and eventually her nieces. She didn't need, the flag legend to make her important. She did that herself with her own 2 hands over a whole lifetime. And that's really, the better story to tell on the 4th of July. Not the polished one, not the fake one. The real story. A skilled, stubborn, hardworking woman who got knocked down again and again and again and just kept going. And really, that's about as American as apple pie and as 4th of July as it gets. All right, That's all the time I've got. We're going to have to wrap this one up. If you want to catch this episode again, you can find it online at RepcoLite.com. Whatever you do today, you don't have to make pain a part of it. Just have a great 4th of July, and I'll see you next week. For Home in Progress, I'm Dan Hansen. Thanks for listening.